Good morning, everyone. My name is Sid Puranik, and today we're going to be talking about political polarization that has started since 2016 in the United States, and specifically how it's affected the workplace. Before I even dive into my research question, I want to offer 4 perspectives on how polarization has changed and has created since 2016 and before. The Pew Research Center published a study back in 2016, which is unbiased and third-party, and one of the graphs that they put out talked about polarization spreading from 1994 all the way to modern day in 2017. And in this specific graph, what they're showing is that the consistently liberal and consistently conservative sides were merged. There was a bell curve of sorts, and there were a large amount of opinions that were shared between Democrats and between Republicans. But since 1994 to 2004 to 2017, that curve, that pyramid, has sort of crumbled. And it's no surprise as to why. Ever since 2016, polarization has continued to grow. And this graph shows how bad it's gotten. From 1994 to 2014, 16 to 38% of Democrats viewed their Republican counterparts as being very unfavorable. And from 1994 to 2014, 17 to 43% of Republicans viewed their Democrat counterparts as being very unfavorable. And continuing on, the purple represents the amount of opinions shared between Democrats and Republicans. And as you can see, from 1994 to 2014, that margin has decreased substantially, with more feuds ongoing between political parties, going down to feuds between people. So there's the history of partisanship. What about the legitimacy and its economic impacts? Betterworks, a private consulting firm based in California that's also third party, did a study in 2016 as well. And they found that 49% of people that work in middle-class jobs have seen a political conversation in the workplace devolve into an argument. And that number goes up to 63% for millennials. And the Society for Human Resource Management also did a study back in 2016 and found that 50% of people have been offended by political polarization or a political conversation in the workplace. And all of this statistics from history and economic analysis leads us to the status quo and pushes us to ask today's question of, how has political polarization instigated by the 2016 presidential elections affected middle-class workers' office relationships? But in order to actually assess today's question, we must first ask ourselves the base question of, so what? Who cares and why is this important? This is District 22, our legislative district that people in Katy vote in. And as you can tell, it's kind of shaped like a bow tie. In fact, comedian Stephen Colbert once called it the most uniquely gerrymandered district in all of America. And honestly, you can see exactly why. Because it extends all from East Houston to West Houston, with this tiny strip going from Missouri City to Pearland in between. But despite its irregular shape, District 22 is actually noted to be one of the most diverse districts in all of America, making it a model for diversity and studies. And the best part about my research is that not only is it validated by a breadth of people with different ethnicities, religions, and races, but it's validated by the single most important thing in statistics and in statistical studies and experiments: a large base, a large amount of people that you survey. So my hypothesis going in was that Democrats would report lower productivity and relationships than their Republican counterparts, for the simple reason that Democrats are angered by their loss of control of government, both in Congress, in the White House, and in the Supreme Court. So my methodology going in to finding out the answers to my question were twofold, because I had a mixed method. The first was a regression analysis, which is essentially finding a relationship or some kind of causal relationship between two independent variables. In this case being office relationships and political affiliation. And the second part of my methodology was a case study, which is essentially telling it like it is. And in this case, it was comparing the two different areas of Pearland and Katy. So my procedure was fourfold. First, I used an app by the name of Polis to actually gather my data from the voters. Second, I planned routes using Polis. Third, I handed out a questionnaire in person. And finally, I synthesized my data to creating graphs and understanding the differences and similarities between Pearland and Katy. So let's talk about step one. Polis is an independent group that allows you to contract PIN IDs and essentially pinpoints houses with free legal information coming from voters. And essentially what it does is it categorizes voters, their houses, their names, their ages, and their political affiliations based on what party they voted for in the most recent primary election. So it can show your name, your age, and your affiliation. And essentially what I did was that I used it in setting up 50 Democrat houses and 50 Republican houses, completely randomly planned within Katy and within Pearland. Meaning that I did 100 houses in Pearland and 100 in Katy each. Now the second actual step was planning the route. As I already said, you can plan routes on Polis that are completely randomized. And in visiting Democrats and Republicans alike, I had to take multiple trips in order to get the 50 houses that were supposed to meet my quota. Now there's the obvious question of what if someone voted independent, or what if someone didn't vote at all, or what if someone voted both Democrat or Republican in a primary? And the answer is simple. I tossed them out of my study because I didn't want alienating answers or alienating responses that could potentially skew the results of my study. And in order to keep my results consistent, I stayed consistent with Democrats and consistent with Republicans. Now, step 3 was the questionnaire. And while I had a slew of questions talking about the backgrounds of people, where they worked, and if they were comfortable with their jobs, etc., one of the most important questions that I asked was this, which is a self-perception question. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the greatest, do you believe that workplace productivity, the intangible, qualitative, opinionated measurement of how much work is getting in terms of for percentage for the amount of time provided, and relationships, an aspect or quality that means 2 or more people communicating or working, has lowered since 2016. Now, I tried to keep my questions as unbiased as possible to make sure that people could respond based on an opinionated scale from 1 to 10. And step 4 was synthesizing the information that I collected to gain that new understanding. And step 4 came in a series of 6 individual graphs. Now the first graph is Katy Republicans. And essentially, as you can tell, there's a unimodal curve with a large spike around the 6 scale of self-perception, meaning that a large amount of people in the 1 to 10 category responded a 6, that there was a growth of partisanship in the workplace since 2016. And while that seems high, Pearland reported higher, with an even larger bell curve, with a single curve ranging from 5 to 2, with a peak at around the 6 self-perception scale, exactly like Katy. And then the total Republicans was almost a very similar curve, with an averaged amount between Pearland and Katy Republicans resembling a very similar bell curve with a large amount of self-perception of work relationships being bad around the 6 scale. So that's Republicans. What about Democrats? Katy Democrats had a large skew to the left, with an enormous amount of them reporting a self-perception rate of 9, 16 of them reporting a 9 in terms of low office relationships. And as bad as that is, Pearland outdid them, reporting 20 in the 8 self-perception scale and 1 going all the way to the 9 self-perception scale, going all the way to an enormous skew in the left, averaging out to a huge skew to the left, with the majority of Democrats both in Pearland and Katy reporting a scale of 6 to 9. So what does it actually mean? What have we gained from that analysis? Well, essentially, Democrats definitely say that there's more partisanship overall, and Pearland citizens report more partisanship in general, both Democrats and Republicans. And for Republicans, there's less partisanship, and again, more partisanship in Pearland. So what can we actually do to build upon my results? Well, that's twofold. First comes HR, human resources changes. where people in companies can actually make changes to accommodate for what citizens, their workers, want in their companies, to draw lines between what they are offended by and what they see as a simple conversation. And second are policy changes, in which state officials like those in Texas could make actual changes in drawing lines between things like districts to change the wonky shape of District 22 to being one that better fits our constituents, all leading and changing today's status quo. So in conclusion, when we reassess my hypothesis, it reflects correctly on what I have found. And while my assumption might not be 100% accurate, it most likely leans to saying what is true. Because when Republicans have had a majority in the House, which was recently taken back just last year, still have a majority in the Senate, have a large amount of influence in the Supreme Court, and still have control of the White House, Democrats and their voter base are naturally inclined to be more angry. These are my references, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Question, your first question?
Okay, what were the strategies you used to conduct a review of literature, gather information from the discipline-specific field, and why did you select those strategies? And did you consider some and reject others?
So definitely, I looked at many different sources, and the first thing that I started with was making sure that they were credible. So think tanks, independent studies, journals, or college-published sources, or unbiased sources was the first thing that I looked at in a source. Making sure and verifying that it had dates, authors, came from a justifiable source, and that there wasn't a slew of opinions with actual logic and fact in the sources was also necessary. And if I wasn't fully sure, I went the extra step in making sure that A, it was either peer-reviewed, or B, it was cited by authors that had credible backgrounds. So yes, I did have to toss out some sources. For example, I originally had planned on using a Huffington Post source that had a survey in coordination with YouGov, which is a third-party private polling database. But obviously, Huffington Post isn't the most reliable source. It's pretty left-leaning. And so after researching a little bit more, I found a more independent source that I then used in my literature review, and then tossed out the YouGov and HuffPost source and replaced it with a better one that I knew was more credible.
What additional questions emerged during your research? And based on your recent experience, what advice would you give to other researchers who might choose to investigate these questions?
So linking back to my conclusion, I think that one of the biggest questions that emerged when I was doing my research was, is this enough? Is the sample size enough to validate the actual conclusions that I have reached? So the best part about statistics is that there's no end, no scope to how validated your sources can be. So while 200 houses is a lot of people, a lot of houses, a lot of citizens to survey, it's not representative of all of Pearland, and it's definitely not representative of all of Katy. Nonetheless, both of them combined. So the advice that I would give to future people doing surveys or doing research similar to mine is that in order to reach the justifications and in order to reach the conclusions that I did, which was that Democrats support a higher rate of partisanship in the workplace, they have to validate their sources and validate their research by increasing the amount of people that they survey, going up to at least 500 if they're given the time.
Okay, for your final question, which of your sources was the most influential? And in what way is that influence apparent in your final conclusion?
So in my research project, one of the things that I did in my literature review was set a background for what's happening in the status quo. And that's why I think that the most important source that I've incorporated into my literature review and all aspects of my research was actually the first one that I showed in this presentation, which was the 2016 source from the Pew Research Center, which did a whole study on political partisanship all the way back from the 1990s to the status quo. And the reason that I think it's so important and that it's contributed to my research and to my presentation so largely was that it set a backbone for what partisanship actually is, and it actually shows visually how it's changed from the 90s to 2017. It gives not only the listeners but myself a perspective on how exactly things have changed from the 90s to today. And because of that, it sets a new pace and a new understanding in my research process for how things have drastically changed from 90s to 2016 and how it could potentially change into the future.
Thank you very much.